Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Apollo 13 mission press conference, and we use the same format tonight that we've used for previous post-mission press conferences. The crew will go through a narrative of the mission, then we'll have question and answers. There'll be only one slide tonight. And when we get to the question and answers, if you'll wait for the microphone, we'd appreciate it. I'd like at this time to introduce the Apollo 13 crew, Captain James Lovell, Mr. John Swigert, Mr. Fred Haise. Jim?
Fine, thank you. Thank you, Julian. I'd like to start out the briefing by saying that I'm not a superstitious person. And therefore, when we were assigned Apollo 13, I thought nothing of it. As a matter of fact, some of my friends of Italian descent had said that 13 was a very lucky number, and they were happy that I got that number. It all sort of started actually just before the flight, as was well documented. As we are approaching the final phase of our training, the last couple days are usually ones of which are taken very leisurely. We try to keep a couple days free just to let ourselves unwind from the long training cycle, to get plenty of rest so that when we launch, that we're in good shape and we can go with a sort of an easy mind. As you well know, a turn of events occurred, and Ken Mattingly, who was our command module pilot, was exposed to the measles. And at that time, we had to make a big decision to bring Jack along or to delay the flight. It was one which was not easy for me to help decide, and when they asked me what I wanted to do, because we had worked as a team for a long time. But I also realized that the space program had matured to that degree whereby we had quite a few people who were well knowledgeable about the spacecraft and who were well qualified to fly. As a consequence, on Friday, we decided to take Jack along, and I'd like to say right now that I've never regretted that decision. We as a team, I think, and Jack in particular, helped us out during our ensuing odyssey tremendously. At this time, I think I would like to just break off just a second and introduce a couple other people of our team that also served, although were not as in the same position we were. Marilyn, would you take a stand, please? This is my wife, Marilyn. What do you want to do, man?
And right next is my wife, Mary.
Now, I think the entire crew of the Continental Stewardesses are here tonight for Jack. Jack had a lot of help on this flight. The launch Saturday morning was not unusual. It was a very nominal launch. The suit-up, the ingress to the spacecraft was very smooth. We had practiced it before. It seemed even a lot easier than I had experienced on Apollo 8. Liftoff came just as I had known it before. Communications were excellent, and the entire boost phase was compared very favorably with what I had experienced before, except during the S2 burn, in which case I noticed the inboard light come on, indicating on the second stage, indicating that an engine had shut down. I had called inboard, as was the normal procedure, and realized then that it had come about 2 minutes early. And the ground confirmed this, and as a consequence, we had an early engine out in the S2 stage, and our total boost time was about a minute longer. This did not impair our flight, however. We had enough fuel to relight the third stage and go on into a translunar injection and a trajectory towards the moon. The flight up until about 56 hours was, I guess, what you'd call entirely nominal. We had followed the flight plan. We were ahead of the game. It took us a little bit longer to get rid of our pressure suits than we thought. And we had asked the ground about 55 hours if we could indeed get into the lunar module about 3 hours early. The flight plan called to go into the spacecraft at around 58 hours. The ground said, fine, why don't you open up the LEM and go on down and do your housekeeping chores. There was one other little engineering task which we had to perform, and also with that was a television program which we were supposed to put on. So we decided to open up the lunar module. Fred got into the spacecraft, went down, looked at the superhelium, the critical pressure on the superhelium tank to make sure it was nominal. We were having some problems with that before the flight. It was. And then we put on the little TV show which was called for in the flight plan. I guess the show lasted for about a half an hour, and just after we had turned off the camera, Fred was still in the lunar module, Jack was back in the command module on the left-hand seat, and I was halfway in between in the lower equipment bay wrestling with TV wires and a camera and watching Fred coming on down, when all three of us heard a rather large bang, just one bang. Now before that, Fred, being in the lunar module, had actuated a valve which normally gives us that same sound. And since he didn't tell us about it, we all rather jumped up and were sort of worried about it, but it was his joke, and we all thought it was a lot of fun at the time since nothing happened. So when this bang came, we really didn't get concerned right away. But then I looked up at Fred, and Fred had that expression like it wasn't his fault. And we suddenly realized that something else occurred, but exactly what we didn't know. I'd like to go on now and let Fred and Jack explain just what their impressions were at this very same instance that I heard the explosion in the lower equipment bay. Jack?
Okay. Excuse me. The sensation I had, that I had felt a vibration accompanying the bang, not a large vibration or shudder. I proceeded to look at Jim, and about the same time, which I guess about 2 seconds had elapsed, when I had a master alarm and a main bus B undervolt light. I transmitted to Houston that we had a problem and proceeded to over on the right-hand side of the spacecraft to look at the voltage. The voltage at that time was completely normal. The current was not high, and the fuel cell flows were normal, which indicated to me that whatever it was some sort of a transient that didn't exist at that time. Me being a command module pilot, and the source of the bang not immediately determinable, it was my thought that, of course, I have a little more confidence in the command module, so I thought it occurred in the LEM, and I said, let's get the hatch in here, and so we can sit back and think about it, because we had the tunnel open at this time, and I was afraid that we might be vulnerable to losing pressure. So I proceeded to get the hatch in, to begin installing the hatch, and at that time, Fred went back over to the lunar module pilot's couch, and I'll let him tell what his observations were as far as the instruments and the other caution warning alarms.
Well, first of all, due to my position being a lot more familiar with the LEM side of the house, my natural first impulse on feeling this shudder and an explosion was to make sure the LEM hatch was latched fully open, because I was just as equally sure that the problem was upstairs and not down in the LEM. And I proceeded as fast as I could from there to my normal position to start looking at the one caution and warning that Jack had mentioned. The situation had changed by the time I got there. When I looked at this bus, it was indicating, as far as my gauge read, lower scale. And I looked at the fuel cell, which happened to be still showing it was connected to that bus, the fuel cell 3. It was not outputting any amps. So my first sinking spell was mainly due to considering the fact that this, that indeed it really meant that we had lost that fuel cell. Also meant by a mission rule that we wouldn't be burning LOI, and with that one problem, we had already lost the landing. Subsequently, I also had two other lights, AC2 and an AC overload, and indeed we had lost the inverter that was being powered off that bus. So I proceeded to switch some of the loads from AC2 to the other inverter that was on the other main bus. And this induced an undervoltage on the other main bus. And that's when I got a little smarter and thought maybe I ought to look at the other fuel cells, which I hadn't even considered as having had a problem. And I found fuel cell 1 also not outputting any amps. From this point on, we were kind of under the hands of Houston and the further troubleshooting and looking at a few more dials down on another meter in the LEB to look at regulated pressures, and eventually we got to the point where Houston called up and asked us to shut down fuel cell 3, shut down the reactance valve, and I asked for a reconfirmation, since when you do that, it's sort of irreversible. If you shut one of these things down, they only can be restarted from ground support equipment. And they assured me they really meant it, so I went through with it, and subsequently the same command was given for fuel cell 1. About this point in time, the cryo pressure, the oxygen pressure, had gone in cryo tank 2, and the pressure in tank number 1 was rather slowly but steadily decreasing. It was obvious it wasn't holding its own. And right about then, it was quite apparent to me that it was just a question of time that the command module was going to be dead, that we were going to lose that fuel cell also. So I kind of lost interest in that position and headed for the limb.
I think one other thing that we neglected to mention, that I abandoned my efforts to put in the hatch when Jim noticed we had considerable venting out the side of the command module. So it indicated we were losing some sort of liquid or material from the area of the service module. So it indicated to us that we truly had a problem in the service module.
I guess it's kind of interesting to know what the feelings are on a crew when something like this happens. When you first hear this explosion or bang, you don't know what it is. And we've had similar sounds in the spacecraft before that were for nothing. And then, to me, my impression was, as we came back, that we had an electrical problem that caused this bang, because in previous testing, we had some problems along these lines. That quickly went away, and I looked out the window and saw this venting, and my concern was increasing all the time. It went from, I wonder what this is going to do to the landing, to I wonder if we can get back home again. And it sort of went into that type of seriousness. And when I looked up and saw both oxygen pressures, one absolutely zero and the other one going down, it dawned on me, and I'm sure Jack and Fred about the same time, that we were indeed in serious trouble. It was apparent, and the ground told us so, and they were right on the ball all the time, that the only way to survive the situation was to transfer to the LEM. And so at that time, Fred, first of all, went into the LEM, got out our activation checklist, a checklist which normally is not used until prior to powering up the LEM to detach from the command module and prepare to go down to the lunar surface. And we started going through procedures to get LEM power on and to align the platform. The first milestone, and I consider this after the accident, I guess, more or less the survival now, the first milestone was to get alignment on the LEM platform. Alignments are important, you know, because without knowing exactly which way the attitude of a spacecraft is in space, there's no way to tell how to burn or how to use the engines of that spacecraft to get the proper trajectory to come home. So we had to have an alignment on board the spacecraft. We knew that the command module was going to lose it pretty soon because we're going to lose power. So as we worked, Fred and I went into the lunar module. Fred got the power on. We started to align the platform. We used a procedure that was in the activation checklist. Jack gave us the angles. There was a little bit of arithmetic involved in all these procedures, and I had on occasion during practice to fail my arithmetic test, and I was so concerned about being sure that this arithmetic was correct that I had actually called down to the ground, let them do the math, came back in and put it in. But we did get a platform alignment, and that was our first milestone. From then on, it was an entirely different situation, and this little model might tell you exactly how we were. Up until the incident, the normal command is in the command module. Control is by the service module engines, as RCS engines, as far as attitude control goes. But we transferred our command to the lunar module, and we are using the lunar module engines for control. We had done some practice in this before, but really had never thought that we'd ever have to use this particular control situation. And to get control of this vehicle, in pitch, you have to use one translation controller in one way, and in roll another way, and in yaw you can use the ACA. So what we did, Fred would handle one part of the control, and I'd handle the other in controlling the maneuverability of the spacecraft. We also had back here a service module that was completely filled with main engine fuel. We had used very little of it, just in one small mid-course burn. And also we had RCS engines that were almost completely filled with fuel. An important point to remember at this time, too, is the fact that we had gotten off what we call the free return trajectory. We had done our mid-course maneuver sometime before, and this meant that we were no longer on a path that would allow us to be swung around the moon and come back towards the landing spot on the Earth. We had gotten off this trajectory because we wanted to go to our landing site. So the first thing the ground told us to do was to burn the DIPS engine, the descent propulsion engine, to get us back on that free return trajectory, which, if I remember correctly, was going to get us into, what, the Indian Ocean, wasn't it?
Yes. I think I lost track of oceans after a while.
Yes, it was an Indian Ocean at about 155 hours.
About 155 hours. The controllability of the spacecraft was okay as long as we had our indicators up, because we had practiced that, as I had said. But suddenly, to save power, we shut that down for a while, and we had to control it by only looking at our computer display. And I had never tried that before. I really don't know who had, and it's a very difficult task. And we spent a lot of our first part of our emergency or survival time just learning how to control the spacecraft in this mode. Our second milestone was what was known as the Paracynthian +2 burn. Our first maneuver was to get us back on free return. The second one was to get us home early. The nominal flight time back home was 155 hours if we had done nothing else. But because consumables were critical, and the ground was calculating consumables, and Fred was also doing the back of the envelope type calculation, which he figured if we were lucky we had about 1 hour spare consumables left before we had landed. We had decided, or the ground had decided, to burn at about 2 hours past the moon, at about 79 hours, a maneuver to shorten the time to get home again. This was also going to be an automatic burn using the descent propulsion engine. And this burn was also very successful. After that, the ground was very much concerned with power, and we were too. And we decided to go into a power down mode. We turned off just about everything, and I'd like to have Jack and Fred tell about our power down situation and some of our survival and environmental problems.
Fred, go ahead with that.
Well, on the LEM side of the house, we actually had already canned a pretty good procedure in a book called the Contingency Checklist, which was pretty appropriate. And I guess, well, first of all, to back up to the consumable business, the 1 hour reserve I computed was on water, and that was for the longer return. So as soon as we got the second burn in, we had a little more pad even. But at any rate, I guess everybody, myself included, got a little bit fooled about how low the limb actually could get down to, and after completing this power down, it settled down on consuming about 11 amps an hour. And that, combined with the command module being completely inert, led us to another environmental problem, which Jim will discuss again very shortly.
Okay, on the command module side of the house, as soon as I found that I had the batteries on the line also to help out fuel cell 2, and as soon as I had ascertained that Jim and Fred had powered up the LEM, we shut down, and fuel cell 2 gave out on us. We powered down the command module completely. Just prior or subsequent to Parasynthion Plus 2, we set all the switches in the command module in a basic switch configuration, this configuration so that the ground and us could work from a standard switch configuration. And then we began a series of procedures. We were interested in, did we indeed have a main bus B, or had we lost it? And the ground passed up a procedure for determining that, and I read out that we had adequate voltage on main bus B. We did have a good main bus B. The second situation was the fact that we were very short on LEM water, so we were not given any LEM water to drink because we needed that for the LEM cooling system. So I had to go back into the command module and repressurize part of the environmental control system in order to obtain drinking water. And there was a number of other procedures which, during the trans-Earth coast phase, which developed, and that was a procedure for powering the command module from the LEM, which was exactly opposite from the usual procedure where the command module normally powers the LEM. We did power up the command module. We did charge battery B to fully charge over a period of 15 hours. We did top off battery A for 15 hours. We did top off the charge on battery B, so we had 3 fully charged batteries for reentry. And then just prior to the entry phase, we powered up some of the subsystems of the command module from the LEM. I think that's one couple of anomalies that we had. We did find that we had one water leak in the LEM, which I discovered when my feet got wet. The LEM water gun was leaking, and we shut that off. I guess it leaked about a quart of water, I would estimate. But it took me about 2 days to get my feet dry, and of course, I think you were all aware that the temperatures were going down in both vehicles, and it's made for very chilly feet for a couple days.
Might give you a little impression of just what the environment was like when the incident, of course, first occurred. Everything was nice and comfortable. And we, of course, had powered down the command module, and we used that as the bedroom. When someone was off watch, they'd go back into the command module, and it was quiet, nice and comfortable, and they'd try to get some sleep. Of course, in the early periods of this particular flight now, we didn't want to sleep too much. We were sort of worried of what was going to go on. I went in there one time to go to sleep, and Jack was on top of the couch, and I said, "Jack, put up all the window shades. Let's get the place nice and dark. We'll just relax and have it nice and dark in here if we can really get some sleep." And I woke up a couple hours later, and I was freezing. As normally happens, putting up window shades in space cuts out the sunlight and normally cools down the spacecraft, but in most flights, the heat from the systems will quickly rewarm it, and as soon as we get the window shades up, you'll be in normal position again. But we got the window shades off after that, and the spacecraft never did warm up again. command module just slowly kept going down in temperature until I think just prior to reentry, it was down to about 38 degrees. And along with that, it was a sort of a chilling coldness. The walls were perspiring, the windows were completely wet, and it wasn't too healthy. I recall that we went in there to get some hot dogs one day, and it was like reaching into the freezer for the food. Jack, why don't you tell them about some of the innovations that the ground gave us in for instance, the lithium hydroxide canisters, which I thought was quite interesting.
Well, we did have a shortage of lithium hydroxide, and the ground read us up a procedure in order to adapt some of the command module lithium hydroxide canisters for use in the LEM. And as they read this thing up, Jim and I constructed one of these things. At this point in time, I think the partial pressure of carbon dioxide was reading about 15 millimeters. And we constructed two of these things and put them online, and I think within an hour, the partial pressure of CO2 was down to 0.2. So these were very effective devices, and we used 4 of these of the command module canisters and never did use the secondary, the main canister that we had in reserve that was for the lunar module.
Of course, as the temperature went down, we became concerned about keeping warm, and Fred and I broke out our lunar boots, which we had stowed away in the lunar module, and Jack looked at his wet feet a couple times. But he had an extra set of underwear, so he put that on. We actually had a third little sleep restraint, which Fred then put on and buttoned up and kept a little bit warm. One of the biggest problems we had was one which might have hurt our trajectory, and that was that we didn't want to dump things overboard. As it turned out later on, it was more of an imaginary problem than we thought at the time. However, we thought we were told anyway that don't put any wastewater dumps over the side because it might disturb the trajectory, and we're tracking you, and we want to make sure that you can come back and hit the proper angle to re-enter. And Fred, why don't you tell them what we did with all that stuff?
Well, the things we had on board that were built for that sort of purpose were 3 bags on board the command module, about that size square, that were really a backup, provided for a backup mode of operation in case the normal Myrtle system failed in the command module, still for overboard dump. But they did have a reservoir. On board the LEM for draining out of the suit on the lunar surface, we had 6 bags about this size in the LEM. Beyond that, we had the 3 UCDs, which are bladder pieces of apparatus that we each wear normally under the suit. And that was about the only natural sort of gear we had for this sort of stowage. So we looked around, and in the LEM we have a tank that's mounted in back of where the flight data file is located on the left side. It's called a Pliss condensate tank, and its purpose is when you're refilling the plisses on a lunar surface, some of the water that's outside the water vessel is allowed to escape, and it's supposed to drain into this tank. So we had enough, fortunately, enough combinations of hoses and quick disconnects between the 2 vehicles using both LEM and command module gear that we found a combination that we could hook up our UCDs to the fitting that went to this tank. So that saved us for a little while. Then after that one got full, we looked around some more, and we'd come across 2 bags, fairly large bags. They're about that long, that were in the LEM. And their purpose was, after the first EVA, in fact, there was one of them I showed on the TV show. We were to use these bags to drain the remaining water out of the plisses and determine actually how much water we had left. So again, this turned out to be a rather weird kludge to get to drain into that bag. I think later on you may get to see that piece of gear. But it involved the use of a 6-foot-long hose with a T in the middle hooked up to this bag, and so we succeeded in using both of those large bags for storage.
Doing that?
I was going to show it at the end.
Oh, okay.
So you see that survival now became one of initiative and ingenuity, and it was one which the ground continually helped us along. We had all kinds of people on the ground trying to think up ways of extending our lifetime. We were also thinking of ways of using perhaps the PLIS system to use it for oxygen or our emergency oxygen supply in case we ran out. But as the flight progressed, the ground calculating our consumables saw that we were actually using less power, less water, less oxygen, and our lithium hydroxide canisters were holding up quite well. So it was getting better all the time, fortunately. We did power down everything, though, and about 105 hours, the ground, after some tracking, realized that we were not on a trajectory that would get us safely back home, and that we'd have to make another maneuver. By this time, the crew stations became a lot different. There are 3 people in the lunar module now, usually built for 2, because the cold had driven Jack away from the command module. And Jack's normal position was on top of the ascent engine can, overseeing what Fred and I were doing. This last maneuver was going to be unique because we did not have the platform powered up, so we didn't have a normal method of determining the attitude of the spacecraft in order to perform the burn. On Apollo 8, some time ago, we were concerned with perhaps losing a platform on the return voyage home, and since no one had ever made a lunar trip before, we were looking at sort of way out ways of determining how we could make these corrections home. And some of our people here at MSC had come up with an idea about using the terminator of the Earth to orient the spacecraft and then the sun position to get orientation and pitch. And with that knowledge, we could then make corrections to correct our angle of entry into the atmosphere. And as you know, I think that the angle of entry into the atmosphere is a very small angle, only about 2 degrees, and so it has to be controlled very closely, and that's what the main tracking is for. So at 105 hours, they gave us instructions to relight the descent engine, to orient the spacecraft in this manner, and give this particular procedure a try. And when they read up the procedure to us, I just couldn't believe it, because even on Apollo 8, I thought I'd never in all the world have to use something way out as this. And here I was on Apollo 13 using this very same procedure that was developed some time ago. This maneuver, again, was completed on time, and because it was a manual burn, we had a 3-man operation. Jack would take care of the time. He'd tell us when to light off the engine, when to stop it. Fred handled pitch maneuver, I handled the roll maneuver, and I pushed the buttons to start and stop the engine. So maybe we ought to recommend a 3-man LEM after this, I don't know. Again, after this maneuver, we were again powered down, and it became one of just merely hanging on. Our maneuvers from then on were merely drifting, and they were done to keep the thermal control of the spacecraft as even as possible so that one side wouldn't cool off too much or the other side wouldn't heat up. And our flight progressed that way down to about 5 hours prior to entry, whereby throughout the night and throughout the days just prior to this thing, the ground, of course, was working feverishly with crews in the simulators and with the engineers looking at the systems to read up to us a set of procedures which we would be able to follow to make a successful entry. And I kind of think one of the most important points that can be made of this flight is the cooperation and the coordination and the initiative that people have when suddenly faced with an unusual situation that can respond to come up with the answers. And they did. They read us up procedures. Fred, Jack, and I practiced these procedures by reading them and then completed them. I think it's amazing the way that people can respond so fast to get this job done. We were in a different situation now because normally when you come home, you have only the command and service module. So the only thing we have to get rid of is this service module just prior to entry of the atmosphere. Coming home now, though, we had a dead service module. We had a command module that had no power to it. We had a lunar module that was a wonderful vehicle to travel home with, but didn't have a heat shield, unfortunately, and shortly we'd have to abandon her. Our procedure basically was at about 5 hours to make another short mid-course correction to again change the angle to make sure we had a good angle of entry, and then at about 4.5 hours to maneuver to a position to get rid of the service module. And Jack, why don't you discuss that a little bit?
Okay, the ground had read up a very, very nice timeline for the whole procedures for as far as the command module went, from 6.5 hours through splashdown. And the part at about 4.5 hours was where we jettisoned the service module. The only, I guess, nervous moment that we had at that point of time is the normal procedures require, we have an extensive pyrotechnic system in this spacecraft, and the normal procedures require arming the logic buses first and letting Houston look at all the relays to make sure that all relays indeed have latched up properly so that we don't jettison or fire a pyrotechnic device which we don't want to. At this point in time, we didn't have any telemetry with Houston, and Fred came up and I said, well, Fred, I'm already ready to jettison the service module, just getting ready to arm the pyros. And he said, I'll get a go from Misfin. I says, Fred, we don't have any telemetry with Misfin, so you're just going to have to put your fingers in your ears and stand by. So I armed the A system, and I could hear the relays, and nothing happened, and I armed the B system, and nothing happened, so I kind of felt we were home free.
Meanwhile, I'm back in the LEM with an open tunnel, hoping that nothing happens.
And the procedure went well. We used a push-pull method, and Jim and Fred were in the LEM and using the translation controller to give us some velocity, and when Jim yelled fire, I jettisoned the service module, and it went off amidst a lot of debris, which is usual, and Jim began to pitch around to try and photograph it. Fred, you might tell him about the pitch around.
You got the first look, see.
Well, the ground had told us that the best view of the service module, as soon as we jettisoned it, was through the number 5 window. This was in the command module. It's one of these side windows. So as soon as Jack had jettisoned the service module, he went over to the number 5 window. Well, the force of the jettison had pitched the rest, and you might see what we have now. We got rid of all this, and so now we have the command module and the lunar module together, which is an unusual combination. We've never flown this before. It forced the lunar module to pitch down rather than to go straight. And instead of pitching up right away, I couldn't see it. And Jack couldn't see it. So then I finally started pitching up, and through this overhead window, this docking window up here, I finally caught sight of the lunar module, of the service module as it tumbled around in view. And it was, to me, sort of an amazing sight. I didn't realize that this whole panel by the high-gain antenna was blown clean off right along the area where the panel normally swings open. I could see the interior. I couldn't see exactly what was damaged. I could see material hanging out from the interior. And about that time, because my description wouldn't be half as good as a good photograph, I reached for my camera. We had 3 cameras, and I started taking pictures through this little docking window. Jack then, knowing that he didn't see anything from his window, started to come down through the tunnel to the LEM, and Fred, meanwhile, had got his cameras ready, and the spacecraft had been maneuvered to a point where the service module was then visible in the front window. And Fred was taking pictures, and Jack was taking pictures of the service module, trying to capture some of the damage that we could see. The remainder of the flight went just as the ground had told us to do it. We had kept in that position, I had gotten an alignment which from the Earth and from the Moon and the Sun, which was good enough to transfer back to Jack an alignment, a rough alignment, so that he could get a very fine alignment in the command module. And at 2.5 hours, he started powering up and getting this alignment. And my only thought then was, as I was sitting by myself inside the lunar module, I could see the Earth because it was the nice big triangular window. Well, Fred and Jack were powering up the command module, and even though it maybe wasn't noticeable to me, it looked like it was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I kept yelling back to Jack, "How are you coming? Are you doing fine? When can I leave Aquarius?" Yeah.
He was a little bit nervous when he kept asking. He kept saying, "Jack, how you coming? The Earth is getting bigger." I think he was trying to hurry me, but I don't know.
But Jack did a fine job. He got a very good alignment, which was, I think, accountable for some of our good automatic guidance into a landing. And finally, when he got the alignment and all powered up, by that time the lunar module looked like just like a packed garbage can. We had the big probe in, the probe, big bags full of debris that we had accumulated during the 6 days. And I then went from the lunar module, closed the hatch, came on down, and we jettisoned the lunar module and came on in with a recovery which I think that you people saw better on TV than we felt in the spacecraft.
That slide?
Oh, yes. Well, we have one picture which we thought Fred might explain a little bit about.
Fred Haise is going to describe one slide at this point. The Apollo 13 astronauts showing their lithium hydroxide canister, their home-built removal system.
There's still a couple of floodlights on upstairs here. The point in the foreground, which you can see, is the hose arrangement I discussed earlier, draining into the plis bag. This is the long object here, water collection bag. The other point I hope to show, now maybe you can pick it up, right in the background here is the modification we made to the ECS system, whereby we used the lithium hydroxide canisters out of the command module, and with the use of plastic and some of our onboard data, the stiff cardboard from some of the procedures we didn't need, and gray tape we have on board, we jury-rigged this thing with a plenum to the LEM ECS intake hose. And this shows only a one cube on. Later on, we further modded and ended up with a stack of 2 on this hose. And I assume we could have, except for the geometry, continued to do so indefinitely.
Haise has described the home-built carbon dioxide removal system, which was put together on the lunar module.
And wait for the microphone, please. Okay. Just start right here.
Questions from reporters now, here at the Manned Spacecraft Center.
Lining up on the Earth and the Sun, when you were coming down that manual business of aligning the platform, and particularly again about when the supercritical helium tank burst, I understand that when you did a non-propulsive maneuver, you were suddenly rocking in the right way.
Well, there was a lot of fortunate incidents in 13 that would make it a completely unlucky flight. At the time it happened, I thought it was the worst possible time. Obviously, it was not the worst possible time for this particular incident to happen. We were lucky in the fact that we had a base support that was well receptive to immediate organization and getting us the problems and the procedures to continue. That we were extremely lucky in. We found out that we could operate the spacecraft and do procedures with a lot less systems than we anticipated. I was very reluctant to turn off the guidance system, the platform, because I knew that once I did that, and we could not see stars outside the window, especially because of the debris that was lying out there and venting from the service module, that I would be very difficult to get alignment on my own. These are areas I think that we were lucky in.
Rudy?
Captain Lovell, what did you have in mind when you made the remark, I think this is going to be the last moon flight for a long time?
That's a good question. We were, of course, you must realize our position. We were going around the moon. We didn't know what happened. And we looked at the moon. I had been there, and Fred and Jack were taking pictures, because regardless of anything, they were bound to take pictures. And I said, come on, we have a burn to go in 2 minutes or 2 hours. At that time, not knowing what we were going to do, and they were getting as many pictures as possible, I had perhaps thought that maybe this was going to be the last moon flight for a long time. But looking back on it now, and looking back on the way that NASA has responded in helping us get home and analyzing the thing, I don't believe that anymore. I think it's going to be one where we can analyze our problems, and I foresee that we can get this incident over with and can charge ahead. I wouldn't be scared to fly with the fix.
Jim, speaking of that subject, flying again, you told us this was going to be your last flight, but that you did want to walk on the moon before giving up flying. How do you feel now? Would you want to go back and take a crack at Apollo 14, 15, 16, or is Maryland...
Well, I'm very much disappointed, just as Fred is, and Jack, that we couldn't complete the mission. We certainly wanted to make a lunar landing. Frau Morrow has so much to offer, we thought. We spent an awful lot of time on it. But this was my fourth space flight, and there are many people in our organization who have not flown and who deserve to fly and who are talented enough to fly. And on my own, they deserve the mission. If they feel that this team should go back there, I'm certainly willing to go back. But otherwise, I think other people ought to do it.
You feel cheated? You are ready to go back. You don't feel cheated if you don't go back.
No, I, of course, would like to have landed on the moon, but I feel that perhaps what we got out of this flight was also well worth it.
Captain Lovell, in that connection, we were told at all the briefings before this flight that Apollo 13's flight plan was a very important one, not only for the science you would get off the moon, but also because of the Pathfinder photography that you would do subsequent to the landing. Now, I'm wondering if in your mind you think that it will be necessary to refly the Apollo 13 profile, and if so, what crew would be better qualified for it than the one which has trained for it for 3 years?
Well, let me answer that question sort of backwards. As I said in the beginning of the conference, that on 2 days' notice that Jack Swigert replaced Ken Mattingly. Ken, I think, is perhaps one of the most conscientious pilots that we have in our space program. He really knew that command module. He knew the flight plan of Apollo 13 better than anybody. But Jack could replace him and could do a good job. I think that it's not so much an individual crew anymore in NASA. I think any crew that was put together can do any job. And if the scientists feel that Frau Morrow is necessary to revisit, then I think that any crew that happens to be assigned to that particular mission can take what we have already done, and we have done a lot of groundwork on Frau Morrow, and improve upon it perhaps, and do a good job.
Just to follow up, are you saying then that Young, Mattingly, and Duke would be a good crew to fly Apollo 13, and do you think Apollo 13 should be reflown, which was really my basic question?
Well, you're basically asking the wrong person. First of all, I'm not in the selection of people who fly spacecraft, and second of all, I'm not in the scientific area to find out just what areas should be revisited. Obviously, we have lost one lunar landing. We didn't make it. If Frau Morrow was worth it, in our training, Frau Morrow had a lot to offer. Then we should go back there. Bootstrap photography is very important. We should do that. But this is up for larger decisions and longer lead decisions.
I wonder if the two newcomers to the moon could just tell us whether they had any impressions of it as they went whizzing by.
Well, we've already been told by Jim what color it is. But no, I think my impression of it as we passed, the closest we got was 137 miles, and I think I have about the same impressions as the men who visited previously, that it's very stark, it's desolate, it's almost awesome in its desolation, and we didn't get the chance, because we were going to be doing a burn, to really do any real detailed looking at it, but I guess that would be my summation of my feelings, that it was almost awesome in its desolation.
What implications, if any, could this accident of Apollo 13 have on future Apollo missions and deep space missions, say to Mars or Venus?
Fred?
Well, I'm not sure there is any sort of direct correlation that I can think of, with the exception of maybe bringing home rather early some of the problems concerned with power down modes of operation and making sure an environmental control system can work equally well to keep the occupants comfortable, both for normal operating power levels as well as emergency sort of power down levels.
Jim, you said you people on TV saw a better recovery than we felt in the spacecraft. Can each of the three of you comment on what your feelings were during your time of splashdown?
Well, of course, when we hit the water, we were very happy to be back home, and we commented on that fact. The recovery of 13 was almost textbook recovery. It was a calm day. The actual splashdown itself was very mild, and the Navy did a grand job. I'm not prejudiced, of course. But we were, of course, disappointed that we did not complete the mission.
How about the other two of you telling us how you feel about flying again, what this experience has meant in terms of your professional careers?
I think that what this has done for me, if anything, has increased my confidence in the ability of this nation's space program to take an unusual situation and react to it and come out with a successful conclusion. I consider recovery of the crew a successful conclusion of it. But I have nothing but the utmost admiration for the people on the ground who work tireless hours to get us back.
And I guess I might answer that by saying sometime this year I'll have had 15 years with NASA, and I don't figure I'll retire for another 30 maybe. So I'll just do whatever job the agency decides is the best place I can be and to contribute the most.
Captain Lovell, was there ever a moment when you or any other member of your crew thought you did not have enough consumables to make it back in those first hours? And if so, what were your feelings?
Well, as I said, our feelings varied during the emergency. There were moments when I didn't know how much consumables we had, whether we could make it back or not. But in a situation like that, there's only one thing you can do. You just keep going. And you just keep thinking up where you can get more consumables. And so that's exactly what we did.
You made any recommendations thus far on changes in procedures or redesign of equipment based on your experience?
No, we haven't. All this will be taking place in the ensuing weeks.
while looking at the service module after you jettisoned it, one of you said, and I'll quote that, "I think the explosion, from what I could see, Joe, had stages." What made you think so, and do you still think so?
Stages? The explosion had what, sir?
Stages. The explosion had stages.
I don't recall that incident. I was the first one to see it, and I said it looked like a mess and that I could see the panel missing. But I don't recall any of the comments that I made.
Terry, you want Terry?
Thank you. Gentlemen, all the time that you were in trouble coming back, you were obviously extremely grateful, and you've told it again and again, for the cooperation of the ground crew, and rightly so, naturally. Was there an awareness, or the same sort of an awareness, of the infinite power watching over you and caring for you to get down? Were you aware of that?
Well, if you're asking me whether I prayed, I certainly did. And I have no doubt that perhaps my prayers and the prayers of the rest of the people did an awful lot, contributed an awful lot for us getting back.
John Lennon?
At one point, just prior to jettisoning the LEM, there was a comment about the flight plan being read up to you, and it was akin to reading War and Peace over the air. I'm wondering what it must have been like to take it down in a spacecraft where at one point someone also said they were running out of flight plan pads.
This was I assume the procedure in the command module, which was quite lengthy. Because one of the things I think that's evident from this thing is we really threw away the book. We had never powered down a command module in space, and we had never reactivated one. And we wanted to get it right. And so I read back every switch and every circuit breaker. And it was a lengthy procedure. It was one that was worked out and verified by the ground, and its success, I think, is well documented.
Jim, did you notice any unusual vibration with the S2 or the J2 shutdown? And if so, could it have any effect at all on the service module trouble?
Well, we did notice an unusual vibration just prior to or just during the number 5 engine on the S2 shutting down during the boost phase. I doubt seriously if it had any trouble with gave any trouble with the service module, but I have no evidence to say yes or no on that.
A question for whoever wants to answer it. Would you tell us, twice during the mission you asked the ground if the flowers were blooming in Houston yet? Apparently this was a code. Would someone explain that? And then the second question is for Captain Lovell. There's a movement in Wisconsin, apparently growing now, to nominate you to run against Senator William Proxmire, and we're wondering if you would comment on that.
Can I answer the first one?
Yeah, the first question, it was again a sort of a code. You're right that we had worked out with our Capcoms, really in asking a question about Ken's condition as to whether he had come down with the measles yet or not.
And we're still waiting for Ken to come down with the measles.
Come on, Ryan. Jim, what about your political future?
Jack, would you like to answer that question? No, I don't have any political affiliations in the state of Wisconsin at this moment.
When you saw the damage that was done to the service module, were there any fears that the heat shield might have been damaged by that?
I had no qualms about it at the time. I guess I really wasn't thinking along those lines because I knew that we were re-entering very shortly, and that regardless of the damage to the heat shield, that was going to either have to take it or not take it. Did you think that?
I had no qualms at all. That heat shield is I don't know whether you're aware of how thick it is, but it takes an awful lot to damage that, and I had no qualms at all.
Jim, you were faced with a perhaps as precise flying job as you ever will face, yet you say you had to fly the LEM a completely new method. Will you elaborate a little bit on how you and Fred worked this out?
Well, the methods of flying the stack, as you see it here, have been worked out before by crews in a procedure which we normally practice for, and that is in lunar orbit, as we're slowing down to go into lunar orbit with this complete stack, if something happened to the propulsion system on the main engine, we might have to use the descent propulsion system engine to get us back home again. This is called a dips burn. And to control this system, if the automatic control is not working, requires this translation controller. Fred and I had practiced that like previous crews, and that's the way we flew this particular device. But in part of our power down sequence, we had to power down the attitude balls, the FDAIs as we call them. And because our platforms in Apollo are 3 gimbal type platforms that can go into what we call a gimbal lock, and we can lose our alignment that way, we had to make sure the spacecraft didn't in its gyrations get near that area. We had to look at the computer which read out these various angles, and it wasn't obvious how to fly it by looking at this computer as it was by looking at the FDAI. In learning to fly just the command module and the LEM, we found out that the attitude controller itself was adequate to control the vehicle in the response that you wanted it to do. This was a new mode of operation. I don't recall of having practiced in the simulator before, and I certainly no one has ever flown it in flight before, but the attitude controller itself worked quite well.
That in the light of the experience you had on this flight, it would be advisable in the future to always remain on a free return trajectory, or do you think that would limit future flights too much to a particular time or place?
Well, I think it'd probably limit our flight operations somewhat on free return trajectory, and I think the fact that we were not on one when the incident occurred, and the fact that we could get back on one, indicates that it's not required to stay on one during most of our lunar missions.
I'd like to ask Jack Swigert, as a last-minute substitution, did you at any time have any doubt of your ability to step in 24 hours before and fly the aircraft or spacecraft?
No, not really. The only apprehension that I have, of course, as Jim says, is that you work together as a crew, and I haven't had much experience. I just worked with Jim once or twice, Jim and Fred once or twice previous. We did find that the 2 days we had working together that we did almost everything the same. And once this was determined, I had no apprehension at all. I felt that it was my job to get Jim and Fred there rested. I felt I could do that. I felt I could accomplish the majority of the orbital science objectives of the flight. And I felt that we had a good mission and we could do it all.
Captain Lovell, did you consider at the time, and do you consider now, that this could have been a meteorite strike or something internal?
This thought crossed our minds that it could have been a meteorite, and I really don't have a complete answer whether it was or not, except for the fact that the panel was completely missing, which indicated that whatever went in must have caused a larger bang to blow the panel completely out, and that's all I know about so far.
Jim, after 2 days of debriefing, could you give your estimate of the best probable cause of whatever blew your oxygen tank and ended your mission to the moon?
Jim, I don't think I can. I don't think I'm in position to, because our debriefings so far have been from the crew's point of view. It's unique, but we were only a few feet away from the accident, but the people on the ground had a lot more information via telemetry than we had concerning pressures and temperatures and possible causes of the accident, and have perhaps a better indication right now than we do of exactly what caused it.
Referring to whether the Apollo 13 crew might fly again to get to Frau Maro, we're informed today that that such discussion did take place at debriefing, and I wonder if you could confirm this and tell us under what circumstances it did.
No discussion of that nature had taken place at any debriefing. As I said, if the agency wants this crew to go back to Frau Maro, we'll be glad to go. If they decide to send another crew or not to go to Frau Maro, That's their decision.
It will go to all three astronauts. Physically speaking, what hardship did you suffer most from? Was it the cold, or was it lack of sleep, or was it cramped conditions in the LEM?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
What were the worst physical hardships for you? Was it the cold, or was it the lack of sleep, or uncomfortable position in the LEM?
Well, it certainly was a combination of all, though the overpowering one was the slow chill down until about the last, 15, 16 hours. It was just, we were just chilled down to the bone from there on in. And we really didn't get warmed up until we went through the power up and started getting the LEM back up, and we started getting comfortable again.
Along with this hardship of lack of sleep, at least 2 occasions it was recommended that you might want to take a stimulant, a dexedrine tablet. Did you do anything to get yourself up for the re-entry?
We took dexedrine just prior to re-entry. We didn't want to take it too early because I was afraid that with my condition, with the lack of sleep, that if the effects wore off, I'd be in worse condition than I was right there then. And I didn't feel too tired. You work a lot on nervous energy in this particular situation, and I didn't want to suddenly get exhausted whereby I wasn't in good shape.
I'd like to address this question to Jack Swigert. This is a lighter question. Has anyone nominated you as Bachelor of the Year, being the first bachelor to go in space?
No, ma'am, they haven't. I think on that profound question, we'll knock it off now. Thank you very much.
Do not blow in the microphone.
That's why I said don't blow in the I don't know how the networks are going to fill, but I'll tell you one thing. There's going to be